Hiya folks, I'm going to finally review or at least comment about this book, Galileo's Error. Somebody in the comment section of this very YouTube channel mentioned this book and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting, and I looked at some reviews and I went out and bought it. It's a pretty good book. I don't know if I would jump on you gotta have this book kind of. I'm not going to give it that much of a glowing endorsement, but I think it's pretty good and worth reviewing. One of the things he does though is he spends a lot of time in the beginning of the book trying to convince you, the reader, that panpsychism is true. So what's panpsychism? Well, if you look on my previous video about the subject, I gave you a nice quote, and I just now turned the machine off and tried to find that quote again, and I couldn't, so I found a quote that's not quite as good from this book. I'm sure there must be something good in here, but here's what it says. Recent thought about consciousness has been dominated by the above two options, which are dualism and materialism, as he identifies them. The dualists argue that there can never be a physical explanation of consciousness, while the materialists retort that the soul can never be a part of science. It is hard to see how this perennial debate could ever be resolved in favor of one or the other option. But there is a theory which concedes that there is an element of truth in each of these arguments: panpsychism. Panpsychists believe that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world. An increasing number of philosophers and even some neuroscientists are coming around to the idea that it may be our best hope for solving the problem of consciousness. So that's it in kind of a nutshell. So normally, most of us sort of think that consciousness is something that happens in our minds, and that consciousness is something that belongs to me. So I am conscious. Or sometimes people even go further and say that I am pure consciousness inhabiting a material body. Some people think that consciousness doesn't exist. That's a weird idea. But there's sort of a materialist, like a hard materialist idea that even consciousness is an illusion. But the panpsychists think that consciousness is an essential feature of the universe. So it's not that consciousness exists in me and then this book doesn't have it and this computer doesn't have it and nothing else has it except maybe the spider mites or whatever that's running around my apartment. Nothing else in this apartment has consciousness. The panpsychists would say, no, everything has consciousness at some level, and they concede that probably the consciousness of this book is quite different from the consciousness of me, so we can't really think of them as the same thing, but they are, in a way, all conscious. And the reason I've been interested in panpsychism is that it sounds a lot like the Buddhist ideas of the universe, and because it is a way of explaining the universe that comes close-ish to explaining some of the experiences that I have had as a result of doing Zazen for 35 years. So I've had some of these so-called mystical experiences, which the best way to explain them is something like panpsychism, that everything in the universe is, in a sense, conscious, or is, in a sense, consciousness. The problem, of course, is this starts to edge into the philosophy of idealism, and if you know me, you know that I'm a follower of Nishijima Roshi, and he rejected idealism as a philosophy. But Buddhism has within it this stream called Yogacara, which I've talked about here, which a lot of Western philosophers have identified as a form of idealism, but I don't think it's quite the same as idealism when it's talked about in the Western philosophical context, although there's some idealists whose versions of idealism sound a bit like Yogacara, and it all gets very weird and convoluted. But the upshot of it is there's this idea that's sort of prevailing among, probably most of humanity, I would venture, that it's something like materialism is the groundwork of the universe, that everything is just made of matter, and that the experiential side of our reality is either something that doesn't exist or something that is apart from it. That as the Hindus say in the Bhagavad Gita, the soul, which is an immaterial thing, Atman, inhabits the body, and the body is gross matter and the soul is not matter, and they're dualists. Buddhists are not dualists that way. They believe that mind and matter are one continuity, and that continuity and that understanding of that continuity, let's say, is in some ways very similar to this idea of panpsychism. The book, for me, didn't really get cooking until the final chapter. So the first, I don't know how many chapters this thing has, but the first, maybe let's say it has 10 chapters. I'm not sure if it has 10 chapters. But, the first 9 chapters went by with me going, okay, whatever, I get, And it's like an explanation of panpsychism and a kind of a big ad for panpsychism. And then the final chapter, I feel like he really gets to the heart of what he's talking about. So I'd like to read you a couple of things from the final chapter. Here's one paragraph. I believe it is still an open discussion whether or not free will is an illusion. But it is worth noting that panpsychism, unlike materialism, is in principle able to preserve its reality, the reality of free will. The materialist assumes that everything that happens in the physical world has a prior cause, which either determines precisely what will happen or, in the case of quantum indeterminacy, determines the objective probability of what will happen. But for the panpsychist, a different model is possible. It could be that past events pressure physical entities in the present to behave in certain ways, but that it is always up to the present physical entities whether or not to accept that pressure. I like that because it sounds very much like Nishijima Roshi's explanation of free will versus determinism. I think this is actually phrased a little better than Nishijima Roshi put it, but I think it's essentially the same idea, which is, yes, determinism, if you take a view of time as a linear thing, seems inevitable, but in the present moment, free will exists within the constraints that the past has put us in. Another little bit that interested me and made me chuckle slightly. Many academics have challenged that's Aldous Huxley's claim of religious universalism, which is difficult to sustain given that the stated beliefs of the great world religions plainly contradict each other. But the thesis that there is a distinctive kind of mystical experience that is cross-culturally pervasive is well supported. The nature of these experiences is perhaps most fully articulated in the Hindu tradition of Advaita Vedanta, which traces its roots back to the 1st millennium BCE, but was most prominently defended by the 8th century scholar Adi Shankara. I find that interesting in that I agree with it about the universality of mystical experience, and also interesting in that this writer, Philip Goff, seems to have completely missed Buddhism, which I think is an interesting sort of PR problem for the Buddhists, particularly the Zen Buddhists, because I would argue that Zen Buddhism is much better than Advaita Vedanta at explaining this sort of mystical experience thing. Otherwise, I'd be an Advaita Vedanta follower if I thought that was better. And I don't think the Zenis have done a great job of expressing the fact that they do have sort of an answer, if we want to use that awful term, for this stuff. And maybe that's because of our reticence to put a pin in it, to say this is what it is. And the Advaita Vedanta people are much more willing to do that, and so their answers for what life, the universe, and everything is all about are much easier for people who haven't had the direct experience of it to comprehend. And what was the other part? Oh, the other part I liked is, according to the theory of physical reality known as supersubstantivalism, physical objects, tables, chairs, rocks, planets, are not distinct from space-time, but are rather identical with mass instantiating regions of space-time. Gotta love philosophical language. That is to say, space-time is not some great container that physical objects are located in. At a fundamental level, all that really exists is space-time. But there is a distinction between those regions of space-time that are massy and those that are not. And the massy ones we call physical objects. On this view, you are nothing more than a massy, person-shaped region of space-time. I think that's probably true. I think that's one reasonable way to look at it. I think the big difference between a philosopher like Philip Goff and the panpsychist supporters and the Buddhists is that the panpsychists, I said in the last time I made a video about this subject, are basically materialists. Well, now that I've read this book, I feel like, okay, well, they're not really basically materialists, but they are trying to get at the problem by thinking about it. So you can get pretty close to the problem by thinking about it, but you'll never get all the way there. Now, Mr. Goff says in his book that he has begun the practice of meditation, but he doesn't have anything to show for it yet, and he'll probably have to do it for 10 or 15 more years and keep up with it and not give up in those 10 or 15 years before he has any real experiences that would confirm his view. But I think if he does it, he'll get there. I don't know him, so I don't know if he's the kind of person who's going to have the stamina to go through it for that long, because it does take a long time. But if you work at it long enough, you do get confirmations of it, and the confirmations of it, I can vouch, are difficult to deny. I'll say difficult in case people want to challenge me, but what I really mean is absolutely impossible to deny. But there you go. So, I think it's a good book. It does a good job of explaining what panpsychism is and what the latest philosophical thoughts about it are. And he does give a nod to meditation and mystical experiences, although he thinks Advaita Vedanta is the best one and doesn't seem to realize that Zen is right over here going, hey! But, a lot of people don't realize that. So there you go. That's my review of Galileo's error. And as to why it's called Galileo's error, the explanation for that is very convoluted, but basically because Galileo, in order to make science a viable thing, took consciousness out of it and said we have to consider physical objects removed from consciousness, and then created a science based on the idea of considering physical objects as their own thing without any reference to consciousness or experience of those objects. This meant that science works really, really, really well in describing the physical world, but cannot ever explain consciousness. And that's the problem. You can't explain consciousness with science as science is constructed following Galileo's model. How's that? I think I explained that pretty well. That's it. So there you go. An explanation of a book and maybe a recommendation of it if you want it. I don't know. If you want to support me being able to buy more books like this, you can donate to me via Patreon and PayPal. As I always say, those are my major sources of income. Books aren't cutting it. Speaking fees don't cut it. I don't take advertising on this video channel, as you may have noticed, but I do accept donations and I really appreciate them. So we'll see you later. Let's hope everything turns out all right on Super Tuesday. That's today. I don't know what all right would be given the current parameters, but we'll see. Talk to you later. So long. Bye.